Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Welsh Republic Podcast, episode 140 today. And I am here with my guest. She's the owner of the website If Americans Knew. Please welcome Alison Weir. How are you doing today, Alison?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be on your show.
It's a pleasure to have you. What have you been up to today, Alison? Anything much?
Well, we're writing an update about the latest that's going on in Gaza, writing some articles, planning some website work, so just the usual.
Have you found anything interesting today that you think people should know about? Any critical news that you found out today?
Well, there was supposed to be a global strike from people around the world supporting the Palestinians who are being attacked mercilessly by Israel. But really, it's been more of the same. Israel pummels Gaza, kills more and more people every day, more and more children. In that sense, there's really not little change from day to day for the past 2 months.
Yeah, it is very sad and very tragic. It is. So, Alison, tell me about yourself. Tell the audience. So, tell us about your background. How did you start If Americans Knew? And you also mentioned in other interviews that you visited Gaza and West Bank. So tell us about, your website, If Americans Knew, how you funded it. How did, your awakening come to the Zionist lobby that controls the United States government? And tell us about your experience that you had when you went to the West Bank, and Gaza back in 2001.
Be glad to. My background is I'm an American. I was the editor of a small newspaper in Northern California in 2000, writing about local issues, not international, not even national issues. But that fall, the Palestinian Intifada began. Intifada just means uprising. And it was in the news for a period. And it was a key point in my life, probably, because I have 3 children, and the youngest one had just started college, university. So they were not at home anymore. And I just randomly saw the news about Palestinians and about the uprising. And I decided to follow the news more carefully than I ever had before. I'd never focused on it before. And when I did that, I noticed that we were getting very one-sided coverage of this issue. I was very friendly towards Israel. Most Americans are. That's our default. We're aware of the Nazi Holocaust, and that's made us very sensitive to Israel, and most people just support Israel without thinking about it. I was basically like that. But when I looked into the news, I noticed that we were getting largely hearing from Israelis, from and about Israelis, which I wanted. That's, of course you want that information. But I expected also to hear from and about Palestinians to get the full picture. And it was fairly clear after a while, to me as a journalist, I think perhaps to other people, but I noticed that we were really getting filtered coverage. We were getting one-sided coverage, and I wanted the big picture, the full picture. So this was in 2000, and Google was fairly new then. The idea of doing an internet search was quite new. But I decided to look into what I could find, and I discovered that there were excellent sources of information from the region itself. Palestinian reports, Israeli reports, there were human rights organizations there on the ground. And when I looked into the information from the region itself, I saw that it was far worse than what was being reported in the US media. That during this uprising, Palestinians, men, women, and children, were being killed every day in large numbers, and they were unarmed. These were unarmed demonstrators that were being shot repeatedly. Often children were shot in the head. All of this was being reported. It just wasn't reported to Americans in our media. So after a few months of looking into this more and more, that drew me in more and more. I also discovered that the U.S. at that time was giving Israel over $8 million per day of our tax money. We were giving tiny wealthy Israel, much more of our money than we were giving to any other country on earth. And yet I hadn't known that. Most Americans don't know that, but it was easy to find out. It's in the Congressional Research Service. It's just that it's never reported to the American public at that time. So with that new information, I decided that I would go over as a freelance reporter, travel over to the West Bank and Gaza to see for myself what was going on. So in February of 2001, I went over there with my notebook and my camera, traveled around Gaza and the West Bank randomly and haphazardly in the middle of the uprising. And I saw firsthand that Israeli forces were shelling Gaza and the West Bank, that many, many children were being shot, quite often in the back. In Gaza, all you had to do was go to a hospital and you'd see lots of children who had been shot. I saw neighborhoods that were bullet-riddled, that were completely, sometimes in ruins. And keep in mind, this was February 2001. This is years before Hamas came to the leadership. No rockets had been fired from Gaza yet. Not a single one had been fired. And yet there was an onslaught against Palestinians in Gaza especially, but also in the West Bank. Gaza is especially vivid because it's the access to and from Gaza, even at that time, was controlled by Israel. So you couldn't get in or out of Gaza unless armed guards let you in or let you out. The first time I tried to go in, they wouldn't let me in. The next time I did manage to get in. So when I came back to the United States, I started the organization.
What would you say in your organization? How successful has your organization been, and what has been, your biggest success story with it so far?
Well, I think we've played a role in waking Americans up. Since I started this 23 years ago, approximately, many, many more Americans are aware of what's going on in Palestine. There's a major change. Back, when I was first working on this, you almost couldn't say the word Palestine or Palestinian if you wanted to put a flyer up in a store or something to put on a talk. You had to just say Middle East. It was sort of taboo to talk about Palestinians or Palestine. So since that time, there's really been a massive amount of awareness now among certain sectors of the American population. I'd say the progressive liberal section has actually learned much more about the issue than they knew originally. Unfortunately, the conservative section, I think, has learned very little and really just gets Israeli propaganda.
It's funny how they say,
the media.
It's funny how they'll say Donald Trump is against the establishment elite, but at the same time, he praises Israel. And he also doesn't criticize them, especially lately how he was at a Jewish conference, a Zionist conference, and he said he would love to go to war with Iran. It's obvious he would, and even if he gets office. Alison, when you were in, visiting Palestine and Gaza and West Bank, when you were there, what would you say was the most heartbreaking story, the most heartbreaking thing that you saw from any victim of Palestinian being killed by IDF? And what would you say, to the extent that West Bank and Gaza, would you say that the West Bank and Gaza, because you know how everybody talks about 15-minute cities, right? How that is a thing that the WEF want. Would you say that, what extent would you say that Gaza and the West Bank is a prison? How much of a prison is it?
It's a prison. The West Bank is much more porous. There's not a wall completely around it the way there is with Gaza. So the West Bank, you can get into places by sort of going around less public ways. Gaza, you can't do that. Gaza, there really is a major barrier that was breached. But in terms of the saddest stories, I guess I would mention three. One of them was a teenage boy who had been shot. He was in the hospital, and his parents were there. And I was there with my notebook interviewing the various people, the doctors. because many Palestinians can speak English. Educated people, very often speak English. They learn English in their schools. So when I was there and I saw this boy, and his mother was, it was being translated. The parents didn't speak English, so she was asking if I could help him. I could, asking me to do something. So I asked the doctor. Sometimes there are programs where injured or sick Palestinians can be brought to the United States for surgery or for medical care. So I asked the doctor if something like that could be done for this boy. And he told me, but it was in English, but the parents were there, but they didn't understand English, that their son was totally and completely paralyzed. He was a quadriplegic. And so I knew something that the parents didn't even know about their son. And that was and continues to be heartbreaking. Then another one was in the West Bank. A 9-year-old boy had just, I had gone to a newspaper office in the West Bank. I believe it was in Ramallah or somewhere near there. And when I got there, the journalist said, since I was a journalist, they told me a little boy had just been shot nearby, so I would probably want to go over there and report on it. So I went over there. I didn't actually really want to. You don't want to go into a home where the child has just been killed. But it was my job to do that. Especially I knew it was my tax money that was making it possible.
Oh my God.
So I went into their home and I saw the parents get home from the hospital with blood on them. And the mother and the sisters were weeping and weeping and weeping. And the father was just walking around looking like he was dazed. He didn't even know. No, he was just, the way I've put it is, it was like he was sleepwalking in a bad dream that will never end.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I said 3, but those are the 2. I guess I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I just hearing about these stories of Israel-Palestine, it really is emotional. It really is, just really sad, and it just breaks your heart. It really does. Honestly, I can't believe, as Alison, as a British person myself, everyone everyone will look up to the Western countries as these role models for the world. But look what they're doing, to find out that our taxpayers' money, like if I could confront the New Zealand Prime Minister tomorrow, I'd say, mate, why are you giving away taxpayer money that is going to killing towards innocent, Palestinian kids? It's just disgusting. It's disgusting, So going back to that, Alison, as we all know, there was one girl, who was that former Congress member? What was her name? Who exposed, how Congress members have to sign the Pledge of Allegiance to Israel?
Oh, Cynthia McKinney, yes.
Yep. So going back to Cynthia McKinney's story about how she said that. So what facts, from your knowledge, from what you've researched, what facts should people know, when it comes to the facts, what facts should people know about the Zionist control in the United States government? How big, especially when it comes to the spyware thing they used to spy on Americans, big tech, how big would you say in money wise, and what facts do you think people should know about that?
I think Americans should know that a tiny special interest lobby on behalf of a foreign country is dominating our country. It's dominating Congress, our elected representatives, the presidency, the very influential in academia, very influential in the media. It's so pervasive and powerful that people are very fearful of talking about it very much. Some people exaggerate its control, and it's certainly not all. Some people talk about the Jews or the Jewish lobby, but it's not. There are many Jewish individuals who oppose it, some very actively, many who support it. But it's Zionism, and it's Congress. People are really fearful of speaking out. Donald Trump is an example. He obviously knows what's going on. Joe Biden obviously knows what's going on. There's if you pay attention, it's impossible not to know. And yet they both support Israel. Congressperson after congressperson says, I support Israel, I support Israel. Even while it's in the middle of a massacre. And even while they're talking about the massacre and saying, well, maybe Israel should pause and let a little bit of humanitarian aid come in. But they always have to preface it by saying, but I support Israel. It's a wonderful ally. It's not an ally.
How much, human aid is America giving to Israel compared to Palestine?
It's giving, it gives Israel over 10, I don't know truthfully, I don't know if the dollars, if this will be understandable if people know American dollars very well compared to New Zealand's money. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I'll just have to give it in American dollars. We give Israel over about 10, right now it's about $10.5 million per day. It's about $3.9 billion per year that we give directly to Israel. Then on top of that, there's another about same amount of about $10 million per day that's expended of our tax money that's expended because it benefits Israel. It doesn't go this is an additional 10 million a day that doesn't go directly to Israel, but it buys off Jordan. It buys off Egypt from advocating for Palestinian rights. Jordan and Egypt, quote, normalized relations with Israel because the U.S. promised to give them money every year ever after if they did that. So we give Egypt a huge amount of money and we give Jordan a huge amount of money. There are other types of projects. I've written an article where I detail all of the different projects where the money is expended, not because it's good for Americans, but because it's good for Israel. So altogether, it costs Americans about $20 million per day because of the Israel lobby. At least that much. But right now, this year, it's about to go up because, amazingly, it's just you have to laugh because otherwise you would cry over this. Right in the middle where if anybody looks, even pays a little bit of attention, it's clear that there's a major massacre going on against Gazans, men, women, and children. Many, but I think the latest number is 50 to 60% of those being killed are women and children. So every day, hundreds more are being killed. Over 1 million, it's getting close to 2 million people are dispossessed, have lost their homes. They're living in extremely difficult conditions. Israel has turned off the electricity. It turns off the internet quite often. It impedes food from getting into Gaza. It makes it very difficult for people to have enough water because without electricity, you can't pump. So there's a humanitarian catastrophe going on right now in full view of the world. And during this time, Joe Biden and Congress, both parties, are planning to give Israel another $14 billion on top of the $4 billion they get. So that means $18 billion this year, which works out to $50 million per day to a country that's quite wealthy and that is creating a humanitarian catastrophe for an entire population. It's astounding to me that this is going on in full view. And yet we have the conservatives especially talking about how, they're against Hamas, but they don't really know what's going on, or at least they pretend they don't know what's going on, and the public is misled by Fox News. it's 20, I'm talking about over 20 years of having looked into this issue. So I didn't arrive at these conclusions hastily. It took me quite a while to really understand the full depth of the influence of a population, of a tiny portion of our population on the American system, on the American society.
You know, one thing I really like about your website is you really pointed out like how the media lies about the facts. So with your knowledge, like you obviously haven't been able, because I noticed on your website, you haven't been able to calculate how much deaths have happened since October 7th, but you did calculate the numbers of deaths since 2000. So right now, Alison, if you can from the top here, try your best. Tell us how big, how different is the deaths of Israelis compared to Palestinians? How many Palestinian prisoners have been, put into prison? How much, Palestinian kids have been killed compared to Israeli kids? And like, how much UN resolutions have Israel got compared? And what other facts do you think that people should know too about when it comes to that?
Yes, I'd be glad to. And if anybody can, you just go to our website, ifamericansknew.org, ifamericansknew.org. We have all of these numbers on the website. You can click on the statistic and find out what the source is, so you can check that these are accurate. So in terms of the number of Israelis and Palestinians killed, since 2000, it's currently over 28,000 Palestinians and about 2,500 Israelis. So we'll just round up both of them. 29,000 Palestinians compared to 3,000 Israelis. If we look at children killed, it's almost 9,000 Palestinian children since 2000. And it's 177 Israeli children since 2000. So again, repeating that's 9,000 Palestinian children since 2000 and 177 Israeli children since 2000. We have been looking into the numbers every day of how many have been killed since October 7th. I can give you those numbers also. These are less firm because many Palestinians haven't been dug out of the rubble. But I'm just going now down to see what the latest numbers are. Sorry, we have a very long report from today. Okay, the Palestinian death toll since just in the last little over 2 months is I'll just round up to round numbers, 18,000 people. The Israeli death toll is 1,147 people. So we've got 18,000 Palestinians having been killed in the last since October 7th, and 1,150 Israelis having been killed from October 7th through today. Of children, the children killed in Palestinian children, it's at 7,870, so we'll basically say 8,000 children. And Palestinian, Israeli children, it's about, let me go down to that number. It's, last we counted, it was about 30. So we hear, well, the number we have being generous because we don't want to, undercount Israeli children. The latest number looks like it's approximately 36 children, possibly, and approximately almost 8,000 Palestinian children. So we're talking about thousands of Palestinian children and 2 digits for Israeli children.
That's unbelievable.
It's just huge. It's huge. So what was coming out about October 7th is Israel has disseminated quite a few lies. There's a lie that Hamas had beheaded babies. Well, we look at the results here, and turns out that at most there were 1, maybe 2 infants that were killed that day. That's it. And none were beheaded, whereas hundreds of Palestinian infants have been killed. Hundreds. But people don't hear about them.
No. When I was looking up research, I saw in your book that, I saw something interesting. I was watching some of your interviews. You said that in the 1800s that a lot of Americans were against Zionism, that there were a lot of Jews in America. Like right now, of course, we do know that a lot of Jews are against Zionism. Judaism, Zionism isn't the same as Judaism, because a lot of people make that mistake. But how did that change? How did America go from a country that was against Zionism to just being in completely bed with it? What actually happened?
It was a calculated, intentional creation. As you said, when Zionism started in the late 1800s, most Jews around the world actually did not join the movement. Not, in the US, in Europe, in the region itself. Most people did not decide to join Zionism. They were happy where they were as things were. I detail that in my book. So Zionism originally was a very marginal, small, but fanatic ideological movement. It was not a religious movement. Most observant Jews were opposed to Zionism and considered it heretical. This was in the late 1800s. But the Zionist plan was to go to Palestine, take it over, and create a Jewish state. At that time, the population of Palestine was about 80% Muslim, about 15% Christian, and about 5% Jewish. So the idea was that they would push out 95% of the people and create a Jewish state. Now, it really sounds like an impossible plan, but eventually they succeeded. They eventually did get massive amounts of money from the Rothschild family and from others. And they manipulated populations fairly effectively. If you get some money and then you have a plan and you're secretly doing things to realize your plan. In the US, there was again, most people don't even, this Zionism is a major ideology. It's a major political movement. And yet, before I started looking into this issue, I'm not sure if I had ever even heard of it. I certainly could not have defined it. So here you have an ideological movement that is causing major changes to my country and to the world, and yet most people don't even know what it is and might not have even really heard of it. So that's an astonishing situation. That's partly how they were successful. There was a movement within, my book focuses on the United States. There was a movement in the United States starting in the late 1800s. By about 1910, it was already becoming influential with political representatives in the large cities, especially in the East. Eventually, a major Supreme Court justice became a Zionist. In fact, was the leader of the World Zionist movement for a period of time. Another Supreme Court justice that worked closely with him, that was Louis Brandeis, and then Felix Frankfurter also became a Zionist, and they worked together. This is all very well documented, often from Jewish sources, Jewish scholarly journals, etc. And they worked very effectively to manipulate the American population. During this time, the State Department, the intelligence agencies, and the Pentagon were actually opposed to Zionism quite often. They wrote a lot of memos opposing Zionism, saying that it would be harmful to the region, it would be harmful to the United States. It was based on principles that our country had opposed from its founding. So there were very strong memos and studies against it. But the Zionists, meanwhile, were donating large amounts of money to politicians, as they do today. And Harry Truman was in a very close race with Dewey, who was running as the Republican at the time. This was in the 1940s. And Truman, they both took positions supporting Zionism over the objections, in the case of Truman, over the objections of his advisors. He supported the Zionist movement. So bit by bit, it was calculated. It's still very calculated. Some of it's out in the open, some of it's covert. Most of it today is out in the open, but most people don't know about it because you have to know the questions to ask. When you ask the right questions, you can usually find the information fairly easily. It's available. Some of it's, more difficult to get, but it's really not investigative journalism. It's just asking the right questions and then researching it.
I know what you mean by that. Another thing is I want to also point out is another thing that people should research is the Terror of Zion, where basically you had the three extremist Zionist groups, Egon, Surfer, and Lehi, which, of course, this was the Palestinian underground from 1929 to 1949, which, of course, they call it the Terror of Zion. And basically it says, how, Zionism was actually the biggest, ideology that from the 1930s and 40s was the biggest, ideology, and like how that was the biggest ideology that was committing the most terror attacks. What things, and especially the bombing, what things would you know about the Terror of Zion and the Palestinian underground from 1929 to 1949? What would you like to tell us about that?
Well, there were two major Zionist paramilitaries, as they call them, but they were terrorist groups. And the leaders of them eventually became prime ministers.
Also, Alison, sorry. I was just going to say, and also, let's not to mention that how those three Zionist groups all joined together, especially knowing the fact that the second Israeli prime minister was jailed for terrorism, knowing the fact that those three groups joined together to form the terrorist IDF. So, like I was saying, sorry for interrupting, keep going.
Yeah, that's fine. They were, one of them, Menachem Begin, at one point was interviewed by a journalist who asked him how it felt to have introduced terrorism to the Middle East. And Begin responded, who boasted not just the Middle East, the world. So they led terror groups. They they would bomb parts of Palestinian population centers. They assassinated people. These might sound like conspiracy theories to people, but they're very, very well documented in a lot of books, both often by Israel partisans who just tell the history honestly. They're proud of what they accomplished. After all, they stole a country. It wasn't a country yet, but they stole a land and population and businesses successfully and established a new country and managed to make themselves appear to be the victim at a time when they were a very powerful entity.
And anything else you'd like to say on the Terror of Zion, especially the bombing of the British hotel?
Yes, the King David Hotel, where they, I think they killed about 90 people. Some of them, many were Palestinian, many were British, some were Jewish. It was a major attack they took credit for. There was Deir Yassin. There were a number of massacres that they committed at the time against Palestinian villages. One of them's famous, Deir Yassin, where they killed hundreds of people. But there are a number of others that are also documented that were. The Israeli media often has good articles about these. People that read the Haaretz newspaper, it's a major daily newspaper, often it's pro-Israel. Its editorials are often honest, but it's a pro-Israel newspaper. But it does at times report things in the history that had been covered up for many years, and then they eventually are exposed. The archives have been opened. Some Israeli historians have written very strong books, especially Ilan Pappé, about what went on in 1948 and since, about the number of the calculated plans to expel the population in 1948. It's important for people to know that in Gaza today, 70 to 80% of the population are families that were forcibly expelled in 1948. So now they're living in poverty quite often in Gaza. Well, just outside Gaza are Israelis living on their land that they stole and having very comfortable lives at a time when the people in Gaza have been under a blockade for about 17 years and longer than that, with insufficient food. Israel controls what gets into Gaza. So often, one minister called it putting Gaza on a diet, reducing the caloric intake, preventing building materials from getting in. Every about 4 or 5 years, there has been a major onslaught against Gaza. In 2014, there was one, for example, and they will they'll kill something like 1,000 Gazans, and something like 10 to 20 Israelis are killed, and it's called a war. It's all this is information that's easily available. And if you go to our website, If Americans Knew, it's there. We give the links for where you can find it. But if people want to research it for themselves, we can find out this information. It's just that the Israeli propaganda is so prolific and pervasive that many people have a belief about what's going on that is the reverse of what's actually happening.
We've got 9 more minutes, right? We said 45 minutes, the show.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just going to mention to you, if you can, with this, is you do a lot of great research. You have a good channel called where you also talk about the U.S. liberty of 1967. So when you've studied that, knowing how people say that Israel is America's greatest ally, but how, especially how Israel sank the ship, the U.S. liberty of 1967, what facts do you think that people should know about that, especially knowing the facts that people, who try to speak against it were arrested or threatened to jail time, the victims of that ship crash? And you've interviewed the people, yes, right? You've interviewed some of the victims. With the interviews that you've done with the victims, what would you say out of all those interviews was the most eye-wrenching story that everybody should be aware of, and the most one heartbreaking story that made you frustrated about your government doing that, lying?
Well, let me give the basics of what happened. Is during the 6-day war, on the 3rd day, there was a ship, the USS Liberty, a U.S. Navy electronic ship, was in the Mediterranean just off the coast of Gaza, monitoring what was going on. Israel attacked the ship over the course of 1.5 to 2 hours. They shelled it, napalmed it, then sent a torpedo ship out to try to sink it. They didn't actually succeed in sinking the ship. They disabled it almost entirely. They killed 34 American servicemen and injured 174 of them. Then the ship managed eventually to limp back into port. But from that point on, what happened has been covered up by Israel and by the U.S. government. Americans, if they've even heard of it, are told, well, it was just an accident, and Israel apologized and paid for the ship, neither of which is true. It was, clearly it was an intentional attack. An independent commission run by a 4-star admiral found that Israel had committed an act of war against the United States, and that Lyndon Johnson had recalled rescue flights to the ship because he didn't want, as he said it, an ally to be embarrassed. The men ever since, and the families of those men, the survivors, and the families of the men that were killed, the mothers and wives and children of those men, have also tried to get some sort of justice. So we interviewed a lot of the survivors at one of their reunions, and created a website called Justice for Liberty. It's justiceforliberty.org, where people can see these veterans now in their 60s and 70s describing what was done to them, how terrifying, it was a hugely terrifying experience. That most of them were injured. The decks were running with blood. Body parts were around on the deck. Describing what went on, the fact that there was an American flag flying very prominently. Israel shot it down, and another flag was hauled up, and then they shot that one also. So the facts are there for people to see, but again, they have to get to the website. Otherwise, it's covered up. If you go to Wikipedia, I believe, which is often heavily edited by Israel partisans, so it tries to claim that this was just mistaken identity, which it clearly was not. I think it's been very hard. I've interviewed the sister of one of the men that was killed about what it was like for her and to have her brother that she had always adored and looked up to killed, and then the U.S. government doing nothing about it. Another sister whose brother had been killed and whose father eventually just died, really from grief, largely from grief. He was sort of a broken man. He'd been I think a naval captain, and then to see the Navy not standing by his son was extremely difficult for him. I think there are so many lies that have been disseminated about Israel. The fact that supposedly it's an ally of the U.S. when it is not, is really, I feel, an enemy of the U.S. It's caused great damage to my country and continues to do that. Other people say it's a client state of the U.S., which is not the case. It really pulls the strings more than we do. And again, what got my interest 20-some years ago was that this seemed to be the biggest cover-up I had ever seen, because it was a cover-up both on the left and in the right at that time. Both the liberal media and the conservative media, both the Republicans and the Democrats were supporting Israel, were covering up the facts. It's gotten a bit better since that time. I think our website has played a role in that. But it's still going on. Here we're talking about giving Israel, as we've just talked about, $14 billion on top of the $4 billion right in the middle of a time when it is committing such a genocide that most of the world sees it quite openly. There was the effort to normalize relations with United Arab Emirates, with with Saudi Arabia, to try to get them all in the pro-Israel camp. It was going along fairly well not because of the populations, but because leaders are often corruptible. But now with this, the genocide really is the accurate term for what Israel's been doing. With it going on now, all of that's falling apart. So the world and the United Nations tried to pass a ceasefire resolution. It was to stop all these innocent lives from being destroyed, and the U.S. vetoed it. It's shameful.
Well, Alison, right now, of course, we have to finish up because you said we had 45 minutes, but it's a shame we couldn't talk more because you've got great stories and it would be awesome to hear more. Maybe in the future we could do another show together. But I just want to say, thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure having you. And where can people find you, Alison?
Well, the website is ifamericans.org. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm sorry that this was not a very enjoyable interview. It's not a little bit of a sad story, so I hope I haven't ruined your evening. But
no, you were fine. You did great. You did great, Alison. You were all good. You were fine. Don't worry about it. But like you were saying, you could find your show, your work.
And I hope people will get my book, Against Our Better Judgment. I think there are links for it on our website. It's a very easily read book because it's quite short. It's half footnotes because, as people might have noticed, I do think it's important to provide the evidence and show that what you're saying is factual and it's based on fully documented evidence. So thank you.
I just want to say thank you, Alison, for coming on. I just want to say to everyone, please go and give Alison the support she deserves. She's very clever when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, exposing the Israel government's crimes. It's crimes they're committing against the Palestinian people. Go and check out her website, If Americans Knew. Go check out her books. They're very fantastic. She's very knowledgeable when it comes to this. You'll be mind blown by some of the things you see on there. So please go follow her on Twitter. Go follow the page of Americans New on Twitter. And yeah, give her the support she desire, and things she deserves, all the support she deserves. Give her all the credit. Very good person she is. I thank her for coming on my show. And also, Alison, just to let you know, I will send you an email to the link of this video so you can share it around on your Twitter. And If Americans Do, would that be okay with you?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So anyways, like I was saying, Alison, thank you for coming on my show. You're doing God's work by doing the things you do. It was wonderful having you. And I just want to say to everybody, thank you for joining the Welsh Republic Podcast, episode 140. Please remember to like and subscribe this video. Share this video around with your friends and family. Have a nice day, everybody. God bless you and take care. Bye, and never give up. Bye.